In this lecture, let's start modifying the appearance of our game objects with materials. At the moment, our robot feels dull. A lack of color makes it boring. An object's surface can be changed with materials. I think our robot would look better with different colors. In the project window, navigate to the Assets directory. Next, right-click in the window, go to Create, and select Folder. The name of the folder will be called Examples. This step is optional. However, we're going to be using this project to create a full-fledged game. Keeping our project organized will help us find files easier. It's considered good practice to get into the habit of organizing your files. For this demonstration, we're going to store example files in the Examples directory. Let's move into this folder. Next, let's right-click to open the menu again. This time, under the Create menu, select Material. The name of our material will be called Robot. Some developers like to affix the word material to the file's name. The purpose of doing so is to make it easier to search for the file. If a file contains a keyword, it'll appear in the search results. I don't think this is necessary since Unity has a shortcut. To the left, under the Favorites section, there's a shortcut for finding all materials in a project. By clicking on this option, a complete list of materials will be presented in the window. I find it easier to use this feature instead of using a long name. However, feel free to use whatever naming convention you prefer. I'm going to go back to the Examples folder. Inside this folder, let's click on the new material. In the inspector, we can modify the material. There are dozens of settings available. For this lecture, we aren't going to explore them all. Materials can become very complicated. To keep it simple, let's focus on a single setting called Albedo. The albedo setting refers to the color of a shape. Before modifying the setting, let's open the preview. At the bottom of the inspector, the name of the material is displayed. Next to the name, there are two horizontal lines. Whenever you see two horizontal lines, this symbol indicates that a preview can be opened. Let's click and drag to open the preview. You don't have to make the preview this large. I'm enlarging it for the sake of clarity. By default, Unity will display a placeholder model to give you an idea of how color affects a shape. After opening the preview, let's click on the Albedo Settings Color Picker. Using the color picker is similar to using a color picker in any other program. We can drag the selection to change the color. As we do so, the preview gets updated. For this example, I'm going to pick the color blue. If you have a specific color in mind, you can use the RGBA or hex code inputs to be accurate. After picking a color, close the color picker. The next step is to apply this material to the robot. There are three solutions to applying materials to game objects. The first solution is to drag the material from the project window onto the game object in the scene. As you drag the material around the scene, Unity provides a preview of the effect. Be sure to drag it on the correct object. You can accidentally drag it on the wrong game object. Once you've found the object, release the mouse to apply the material. This is the first solution. I'm going to undo the material. The second solution is to drag the material over to the robot object in the hierarchy. Unlike before, a preview does not get shown in the scene. The material gets applied after you've released the mouse button. One more time, I'll undo the change to the object. There's one final option to modifying the material of an object. From the hierarchy, select the robot game object. Next, in the inspector, there are two components called Mesh Filter and Mesh Renderer. Both components are necessary for rendering any 3D model. Let's briefly dive into the world of 3D modeling. Models have something called a vertex. A vertex refers to a single point on a model. The plural word for a vertex is vertices. Look at this example. The white dots represent a vertex. When vertices connect, they create an edge. Lastly, A flat surface is created when multiple edges are connected. We call this a face. The combination of vertices, edges, and faces is called a mesh. Meshes provide information on how a 3D model is constructed. Without a mesh, Unity or any other program won't be able to render a model on the screen. Typically, 3D objects will always have two components. The first component is the mesh filter. The mesh filter component will load mesh data for a game object. It does not draw the mesh onto the scene. There's one option called Mesh. On the input, there's a button we can click on. This button opens a list of meshes in our game. By default, we have access to Unity's meshes. Switching to different shapes is possible without having to recreate the object. For example, I can change the robot's shape to a sphere. You don't have to use a sphere. This was just an example. I'm going to revert the shape to a cube. The second component is called Mesh Renderer. As we discussed before, rendering is the process of drawing a shape onto the screen. Therefore, we can assume the Mesh Render component will draw a mesh onto the screen. So, you may wonder, why am I spending so much time talking about meshes? It turns out that materials can be updated through the Mesh Renderer component. Looking closely, we have a section called Materials. Under this section, a list of materials can be applied to a game object. Multiple materials can be added to a game object. However, the mesh must support multiple materials. You can't force an additional material unless you have access to the original model. In this case, Unity's 3D objects support one material. We can click on the button to bring up a complete list of materials. Let's select the robot material from the list. The material has been successfully applied to the game object. Hopefully, this information was helpful. In most cases, I prefer dragging the material onto the object. If a 3D object is complex, I apply materials through the Mesh Renderer component. In the next lecture, let's tackle an exercise.